You mentioned Harvey Sacks and his work, and in the past you've often said that Harvey Sacks is a source of inspiration for you.
Yes, that's right.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, Sacks is with Shegloff, really, and Jefferson. But first Sacks, the originator of conversation analysis. And that is important enough in its own right. But even more than that, I think, is what I find inspiring, a number of things. One is the spirit of inquiry that Sacks displays, especially in his lectures. I just love the way he does that. So this kind of inductive, investigative inquiry into how orderliness is produced, how members live their lives in accountable ways, accountable in their own terms. I think that's a wonderful thing. And the way a lot of his lectures start in this way, that he comes into the lecture with something that he's found. Some of them are not like that, but he comes in and says, here's something, and it's a snippet, of conversation, or something he will have on a handout, or he'll have a couple of examples. And he will want to explore and tease that out and see what can be generated from it and see how it works. And I think that spirit of inquiry, which is not only some narrow empiricist attention to conversational recordings, but was full of erudition, references to the literature, to Freud and Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, to ethnographies and so on. There's a sense of broad erudition in Sacks. He's a guy who seemed to be a true academic, which for me is a compliment. Another admirable thing, inspiring thing, is his ability to see things. That you have this little snippet or an example, a quotation or a recording, and it's the ability to see things that are easily available to see but nobody had noticed. It's like Garfinkel says, that the seen but unnoticed features of social life are the topic of ethnomethodology. So conversation analysis is a hugely productive research program of the kind of ethnomethodology that was around in the 1960s. Another thing, since I'm on it, shouldn't get me talking about Sacks, but it's the requirement and the respect that he shows for the detail of social life, whether recorded or noted or whatever it would be. And that respect for the detail I hear as a respect for the people whose data we're examining. He's not going to give them a questionnaire, put them in an experiment, interview them on topics of his own choosing. He's got their lives as lived, and he's respectful enough of it, not to gloss it, not to provide a summary of it, or an ethnographic description of it, or a quotation of it, but a recording of it. And you look at it in its detail, because what you're interested in is that it's got this idea, again, I talk about the conception of social life, that whatever people are doing, they did it exactly in the way they did it. If you want to understand what they're doing, you've got to pay attention to exactly how they did it. And you've got to avoid preferring that they'd done it some other way or that they'd done some other thing you wish they'd done. You've got to get out of that. And for me, quite a lot of work in social sciences is that kind of preference, that people had done something other than they did, and that you want them to do what you want them to do, and you're kind of unhappy with what they said. You'd rather they said something else because you've got some theory that you want to, use it as an illustration of, or whatever it be. I've come across that kind of impatience, and I prefer the kind of respect Sacks has for the detail of actual lived lives, even more than the ethnographers. He wrote, one of his lectures is on ethnography, and he has a lot of respect for ethnography because it pays attention to the lived details of life. But an awful lot of ethnography is observers' descriptions and interviews. What Sacks was doing was something else, which was trying to examine recordings of actual slices of life. And that's something different and has led to what is now conversation analysis. suppose one last thing is that there are things in Sacks's work which point to discursive psychology. Like, for instance, the thing I mentioned earlier, I think, which was the way of approaching and getting to grips with understanding or comprehension. In cognitive psychology, this is comprehension. It's a important topic. How do people understand the language they hear and the text they read? Well, you can set it up. You can give them funny-looking texts and things, and you can probe their understanding of it and their memory of it and so on, and you can find out how their minds work. Whereas what Sacks explicitly points to is this notion that you can treat that as a member's topic, because how and whether people understand each other arises in the first place as a problem for them rather than for a psychologist or for an analyst. And to the extent that talk works, I'm quoting now, I think, maybe Shegloff, to the extent that talk works, it solves those problems. So for discursive psychology, you can simply adopt that. That's a way of doing discursive psychology. Let's see how the participants in social interaction overtly and publicly, for themselves and for each other, handle and manage the kinds of things that a psychologist might want to design a questionnaire for, or a test or an experiment for.
Can you tell us a little bit about your past research projects, and if you have any favorite projects or papers that you've authored?
Favorite projects or papers? Okay, I'm about to insult all kinds of people I've worked with by not choosing the work we did together. And I suppose I should say I don't really think of my work in those terms of favourites. I think of it as a continuously developing thing with maybe a few embarrassing bits that I won't bother talking about. But if I had to pick a favourite project, it's probably the one I did with Liz Stoker, which involved, because it was a big project, involved collecting recordings of police interrogations with suspects and of neighbour complaints and other phone calls to help agencies, environmental health and things like that. One thing I like about that project was how hard it was to get the data. And I have to say, Liz got it. Liz had done all the spade work and did that. But so through Liz's efforts, I managed to get hold of some really hard to get stuff. And I was particularly pleased with the police interrogations. These were just so intrinsically interesting, which you're not supposed to say really about data, but it was terribly interesting in that really insignificant things about people's lives and actions were at stake there. But also really central themes for discursive psychology were at stake, such as people's accounts of events, of what had been done and what people did. So it's kind of a kind of practical memory experiment in some way. But also there is the central role of mental states in the accountability of action and in relation to crime. And one of the key concepts in criminal law is intentionality. I mean, there are whole categories of crime where more or less the same action takes on a quite different seriousness if it's considered intentional. And there are levels of intentionality, and there are intentionality for different things, such as for the action you did and for the consequences of the action. So I found teasing out those things, notions of events and accountability and mental states and intentionality, I found that fascinating and fruitful. I wrote something on it, on the legal concept of mens rea, which is the role of intentionality in crime. And yeah, I enjoyed that a lot. And we still have loads of that data, which we've only scratched the surface of, really. I mean, Liz is continuing working on it and with it and collecting other stuff too. But I suppose for the sheer scope of it, I think that project has to be one that I particularly liked. I also liked the data, especially the police data. I liked it for a really simplistic and naive empiricist reason. which I'll have to say in those terms. And that is that for some people, the ideal data is data untouched by the researcher. That's one ideal. For some other people, the ideal data is where the researcher is actively and even aggressively involved in its production and rhetorically engaged and so on. And there are cases for all these things. But one kind of ideal data is this fly-on-the-wall notion that you're just recording what people did, and they're not doing anything because they're being recorded. Or, no, not that. They're not doing anything because of the research being done. Now, the thing with the police recordings is that those tape recordings had already been made by the police as part of criminal procedure and for possible use in court. And copies are given to the solicitors and so on and kept for use in court. So the recordings were produced, and orientations by the participants to those recordings were part of the phenomenon. And as researchers, we could just manage to get access to them and look at them. And I kind of like that. There's some kind of purity in it, which I'd have to have an argument with other people about what sense of purity that is and how disgusting it is that I think it's a kind of purity. But still, that's I like that. I'll just say I liked it, you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. More recently, you have published a paper with Jonathan in the journal Discourse Studies on subject side and object side assessments. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose, people can read the article, but I'll say something about how it originated. And that is that in, say, conversational analysis, the ideal kind of analytical approach is what's called unmotivated looking. That is, you've got recordings of stuff and you just start going through it for whatever you might find. And you're not testing a hypothesis, or at least not at the beginning stage of your research. You're just looking to see what you can find. This didn't start like that. Well, it did in a way, but it didn't start from data. And it didn't start from theory. It wasn't like other work where we're, say, trying to re-examine the concept of attribution theory or script theory or memory or whatever. It just started from just noticing in ordinary life people saying things. And something I kept hearing was people saying something like, "That was great, I loved it." Or, "I hated that, it's awful." And they say those two things. Now, this article isn't all about people saying the two things. It came out of that. But this is the first observation, to think, and I said, why do people say both those things? That was great, I loved it. Or, that was awful, I hated it. Are those the same things? Are you saying the same thing twice? Or is there a difference? Is there a function in saying it twice? What if you just say one of them? When do you say it once or twice? Why do you say one thing or the other one when you just say one of them? So it began as that kind of question. And clearly there was a phenomenon to be explored, which is already in the CA literature, which Anita Pomerantz had studied in her PhD and in subsequent papers, which is called assessments. And so, people routinely, when they produce descriptions, routinely kind of produce assessments. In some cases, people feel that some assessment is due, that it's not enough to just say something about whatever. You're meant to provide your stance or your take or your response to it and so on. So there was a literature in which the notion of assessment could be done. And the first characterization of those pairs was to look at what's the difference. And they seem to be subject side, object side. That's how it came. If you say, "That's great," you're saying the object's great. That's great. I loved it. You're saying something about me. I is the subject and loved is the experience and so on. So it's like you're assessing the world and you've got two kind of resources. You can describe the object in favourable terms, or you can describe your own subjectivity towards that object. And that's a classic discursive psychological interest. And I hadn't seen that discussed in the CA literature. And it could be that maybe it's because discursive psychologists are interested in that kind of thing, it becomes visible. I don't know. But anyway, Jonathan and I discussed that over quite a lot of time and started seeing it and talking about it. And eventually it became a plenary talk for DARG's 25th anniversary, because that was just the work we were doing at the time. And then I retired. And then after years of nagging me from Potter, eventually we produced that article. But the aim of the article is to be an initial statement of a topic that then we or other people can pick up and see where it goes. It may run into the ground, or it may develop something, or it may change, I don't know. But that was the aim of it, to kind of point to a phenomenon that might be of interest.
So is the article then related to your current research interest, or are you interested in something else at the moment?
My current research interests, I have to confess that I enjoy being retired, and it's not obvious to me that I have much of an investment in current research interests. At the same time, I rather pathetically do often, before falling asleep or when waking up or when snoozing in front of the television, have thoughts, and I just can't help ideas going around and thinking, oh, that's interesting, or work things out, or I've got notes, I keep making notes. So I kind of can't stop really being, the academic person I've always been, while at the same time I do enjoy not having to turn that into a grant application or an article and so on. But it's quite possible that further work on assessments will be done by Jonathan, Alexa, and some of the people at Rutgers, by anybody else who's interested, and maybe even by me. So I am scheduled to discuss those things with Jonathan and Alexa. Maybe I will. But there's another thing. I've got a long-term interest in child development, of course, especially in kids who can't talk, the beginnings of language, before children can talk. I've got an interest in becoming human, in how adult humans with the full panoply of accountability and natural language that we have, how we somewhat incorporate less competent beings into the world and bring them into accountability in human terms. Some of those are kids, and it's a quite natural process of acculturation. The kids get incorporated and described and invited and so on into being members of a culture. And that's a fascinating point of interest, I think, that I have long term. And another is artificial intelligence for the same reason, and another is animals, and especially pets, especially animals within human interactions. And I share an interest in just about all those things with Carly Butler, who has a lovely horse named Mary. And so Carly and I have talked a bit about maybe doing some research on human-animal interaction. Now, I think that's mainly Carly's project, and to what extent I'm involved, I'm not sure. But I hope something comes of that, if anything. But first and foremost, I'm done, really. I watch TV.
Great. So we have looked back at the history of discursive psychology. If you look forward, what do you see? Where do you see discursive psychology going in the future?
I think that's something that's up to other people to do, and I'm largely happy to let them do that. Yet, I can't help having a bit of stake and interest, I'd be quite kind of pleased if amongst the work that gets done, some people would pursue the kind of things I was interested in and never got around to doing. And those kinds of things are what I could roughly call pure DP. They would involve analysing ordinary conversation for the ways in which people invoke psychological characteristics and mental states. There's a kind of pure body of research before we start being applied about it or finding specialised settings or whatever it would be. I think there's a lot of basic work needs to be done on how psychology is imbricated, if I can say that, in the everyday practices of natural language and accountability. And there's so much more to do. I sound a bit like Shegloff here, wishing everybody was doing pure CA, and not going off getting too bothered about institutions. There's the toolkit still needs developing. So yeah, but by and large, I think people will pursue their own interests. I'd like to see a bit more input into DP from linguistics as well. I think linguistics is a problematic discipline. I like CA's revised version of what language is and how it works. But there are some things worked out in linguistics, especially in pragmatics, certainly in phonology, but also in things like modality, which I think are important and can inform interaction analysis and prevent people reinventing the wheel. And so I'd like to see a bit more of that, but nobody gets trained that way. I say nobody, that's wrong. There are people who come into CA from linguistics. But a lot of people in DP and CA originate in sociology and psychology, and they start studying language without having studied it from the discipline whose name is all about studying language, and that's linguistics. And I think a bit more needs to be done by people, a bit more homework needs to be done. So I'm thinking of myself as well in that way, that when I started doing my PhD as a psychologist, looking at, or trying to look at the origins of language, I needed some way of describing what kids were saying and doing with a view to the notion that we're heading towards adult competence in language. What's that? So, I needed to do some linguistics. I had to find out where were the kids going? What was it part of? What were they learning? And so linguistics was important then for me. And I think it still is, for people doing interaction analysis. I don't want to push it too far. I'm just saying that because there's a relative lack of it. If there was a lot of it, I'd be saying, forget that, study interaction.